Subqueries, as suggested by their name, are just queries within queries. As you saw in your reading, there are lots of different ways to use subqueries. We'll work through some examples of using subqueries in this video. Problem 1. Write a query to select the person ID, person first and last name in format first last as a column aliased full name, and select the maximum bill amount for each patient using a subquery in the select clause. Select only people from the person table who also have a row in the patient table and whose preferred treatment site is 1, Otherton Urgent Care Clinic, by using a subquery in the where clause. Order the query by last name, then first name. In this query, we actually have two subqueries. We have one in the select clause, which is going to create a column in our results that will have the maximum bill amount for each person selected. And then we have a second subquery in the where clause that says we're going to select rows from person where there's a matching record in the patient table and the patient preferred site is 1. So we're selecting our person ID, person first and last name in the format first last, so we use the plus signs to concatenate a space in between, and we alias that column as full name. And then we're selecting the max bill amount from the appointment table, where the patient ID in the appointment table is equal to the person ID in the person table. So the max bill amount for each person, each row that gets returned. We're selecting all that from the person table, where the person ID is in, and then we have our subquery that's selecting all the patient IDs from the patient table, where the patient preferred site is 1. So if you run this query by itself, I've copied it down here. You'll get the result of all the patient IDs where the patient preferred site equals 1. So when we use this in statement with the subquery, it's equivalent to saying person ID in 1000, 1004, 1024, etc. By using the subquery here, we let the query do the work for us and we don't have to manually find all the patient IDs from the patient table and hard code them into our query like that. Running your subquery by itself can be very useful when you're writing and testing queries. And here's our result. Problem 2. In the previous problem, we specified 1 as the preferred site. Modify the query so it uses a nested subquery to select rows from person where there's a matching record in the patient table, and the patient preferred site has a description that begins with beach. What I did here was, rather than to hard code my site ID 1 into the query, I changed my mind and I wanted to get the patients whose preferred site is Beachview North or Beachview South. And I wanted to use the site description to select those patients rather than using the site code. To do this, I ended up using a nested subquery. And I actually wrote this new subquery inside my original subquery that selects the site ID from the site where the site description is like beach. So the name of the patient preferred site begins with beach. Don't forget that wildcard there, the percent sign. So the query will select all the descriptions that would begin with beach. If you leave out the wildcard, you'll actually get no results. So we have a subquery now that's selecting all the patient IDs from the patient table where the preferred site is in the sites that have a site description beginning with beach. And make sure both subqueries are in parentheses. So the parentheses for the outer subquery are this one and this one. And the parentheses for the inner subquery are this one and this one. Problem 3. Use the exists and not exists operator to write two queries. Number 1, find out which sites do not have any appointments scheduled. Number 2, find out which patients have appointments scheduled. In this first query, we're selecting the site ID and site description from the table site where not exists, and then a subquery select star from appointment where site ID equals appointment site. Basically, what the not exists operator will do in this example is that for each site, it will test the subquery to see if it gets back any results. If you were to run this subquery by itself for a site, you would be able to tell if the query returned any results. For example, if you run the subquery where appointment site equals 1, you would get back rows because there are appointments scheduled at the site with site ID 1. But if you ran it for site 3, you would not get back any rows because there aren't any appointments scheduled at the site with site ID 3. Same for sites 7 and 8, and therefore those are the three sites, 3, 7, and 8, that get returned by our main query. Because no appointments exist at those sites. They do not exist. Here in the second example, we're selecting the patient ID from the patient table, aliased P, where exists, and then our subquery select star from appointment where p.patientid equals a.patientid. In this case, we have to use aliases in the subquery because the patient table and the appointment table both have a field, a column named patient ID. Using the alias lets the query know which field we're referring to, the patient ID in the appointment table or the patient ID in the patient table. This works the same way as the previous example, except of course we're using exists instead of not exists. So for each patient, the query is going to go through and execute the subquery. In this case, if the subquery returns a result for that patient, then an appointment exists for that patient. Otherwise, the appointment does not exist. So running this subquery by itself, for patient 1040, and I'm not in my corrected database. Now I am. Will get you results. Notice that running the subquery for the patient returns 2 rows. The number of rows it returns doesn't matter as long as it returns at least 1 row. So appointments do exist for this patient 1040. If we run the subquery for patient 1000, however, no rows are returned. Therefore, no appointments exist for this patient and no row will be returned for this patient in your main query. So no 1000 in the results, but there's patient 1040. Problem 4. Write a query that uses a subquery and the where clause to find all appointments where the bill amount is less than the average bill amount for the site where the appointment occurred. Here what we did is to select the appointment ID, the appointment site, and the bill amount from appointment where the bill amount is less than, and then we put our subquery here that finds the average bill amount for that site. I'm using aliases here to make it easier to see that we're comparing our appointment site in the subquery to the appointment site in the main query. And I should point out here that you usually use the as keyword to declare those table aliases, but just like there's an implicit way to define joins, there's an implicit way to alias tables, and that's just to put the alias name after the table name in your from clauses. That's what I've done here in case you're missing the as keyword. This is what's sometimes called a correlated query or a synchronized query because the subquery is actually going to get run for every row of the main query rather than just being run once for the main query. Problem 5. Write a query to select the last name and the first name of each female person in the database using a subquery in the from clause of the statement. This is pretty simple, really. All you have to do is substitute a query that selects all the female persons where you would normally put the name of the table you are selecting from. You can get a lot more complex with this, but this is a basic example of using a subquery in the from clause of your query. Basically here, instead of selecting rows from a table, we're selecting rows from the results of a subquery that acts as a table. In the next module, we'll talk about manipulating data in the database. See you then.